All right, well, I am delighted that you are all here today. I can't see you at the moment, but at the end of the presentation portion, we'll open it up to a gallery view so everyone can see everyone else, and we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers and discussion. Once again, I am grateful to be sharing this time with you as together we explore racism in America, the history we didn't learn in school. Today, we're going to focus our attention on part 4 of 6, entitled Mass Incarceration and the War on Drugs. As we've seen in our country's history described in these last 3 weeks, the relationship between African Americans and our country's justice systems, both the legal and the extra-legal ones, has been one of violence and oppression. We see the harbingers of what is to come in the system of convict leasing that followed the end of the Civil War. The echoes of lynching made manifest in the uneven application of the death penalty today. And the videos of unarmed Black men being killed by police bring home the continuing violence that stalks our land. The impunity with which these acts have been carried out echoes loudly in our current circumstances, although we are beginning to see some few glimmers of more accountability, more justice. So today we focus on the period following the landmark civil rights movement to observe what we have come to expect as the inevitable backlash against racial progress, and see how the combination of power and bigotry, the very definition of racism, shapes today's criminal justice system. So let's continue. We begin with a brief recap from last week's class, where we moved into the 20th century and saw the enormous efforts made around housing segregation and the role played by the FHA, and most particularly the Home Ownership Loan Corporation's residential security maps that defined and delineated what we have come to see as the process of redlining. We looked at some significant elements of public policy, Social Security and the GI Bill, and the ways in which discrimination were an integral part of those policies as they were implemented, even if it wasn't the way they were originally envisioned. We looked at the Brown v. Board of Education decision by the Supreme Court and the massive resistance that resulted to federal attempts to integrate schools. And then we turned our attention to the heroic actions and the significant achievements brought about by the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s that culminated in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, both of which have continued under assault ever since. So we're going to speak today about mass incarceration. And I would contend that there have been 3 phases of mass incarceration in our country. The first certainly was the institution of slavery itself, which for more than 220 years completely constrained the ability of those brought from Africa and their descendants in terms of where they could live, what they could do, how they could behave, and who would benefit from their labors. Phase 2 began actually about the middle of the 19th century, but it accelerated at the time of Reconstruction, when states passed laws called Black Codes that specifically targeted African Americans, resulting in their arrest, conviction, and incarceration. And then, because of the loophole in the 13th Amendment, allowed the states to utilize their labor first through convict leasing, subsequently through public chain gangs, and even today through the unpaid labor of those incarcerated in our prisons. Today, we're going to turn our attention to the period following the Civil Rights Movement, the major accomplishments of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1970s, and look at mass incarceration and the war on drugs. Why do we call it mass incarceration? The United States is home to less than 5% of the world's population, but we have 25% of the world's inmates. In 1972, there were excuse me, somebody isn't muted. Maybe if you could mute yourself, that would be great. In 1972, there were 200,000 people incarcerated in American prisons and jails. By 2017, that number had increased by an order of magnitude to 2.3 million people incarcerated. And in total, at any given point in time, more than 7 million people in our country are either incarcerated or on parole or probation under the control of the criminal justice system. And so during this period of time, mass incarceration in the United States has emerged as a stunningly comprehensive and well-disguised system of racialized social control, strikingly similar to Jim Crow, a system of social control unparalleled in world history. No other country in the world imprisons so many of its racial or ethnic minorities. Imagine if Germany were to do this with its Jewish population today. Incarceration rates are due to consequences of poverty, racial segregation, unequal educational opportunities, and the presumed realities of the drug market, and more. Studies continually show that people of all colors use and sell drugs at remarkably similar rates. Yet when we look at incarceration on the basis of drug use, we find that there has been a hugely disproportionate impact on people of color. And while the Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination on the basis of race in all sorts of aspects of human life, today it is legal to discriminate against criminals on precisely those same areas. So while the Civil Rights Act may have said you cannot discriminate against Black people in these areas, indeed you can discriminate against criminals in education, in housing, in jobs, in voting, in food stamps, in public benefits, and exclusion from jury service. So we have simply substituted one categorization for another. What do we know about the people who are incarcerated? Here is a chart with data from 2019, and it looks at rates of incarceration per 100,000 people in the population. So for every 100,000 Black people, nearly 1,100 are incarcerated. 547 American Indian or Alaska Natives, 525 Hispanics, 214 white people, and 46 Asian. So a huge disparity in incarceration rates. Now, I want you to pay particular attention to this next chart because there's going to be a test at the end on the details included in it. Well, perhaps not. But this is a representation of the approximately 2.3 million people incarcerated in federal and state institutions. It does not include and it does include local jails as well. So of that number, about 350 are incarcerated because of drug offenses. 800,000 are categorized as violent crimes. But it's really important to realize that in many instances, there are drug crimes that are categorized as violent, even though no violence ever occurs. But that categorization has been put on a whole range of drug crimes, even when there's no violence involved. Really significantly and not terribly visible through this chart is the fact that nearly 500,000 of those people are incarcerated awaiting trial. Not only have they not been found guilty, they haven't even had an opportunity to be tried, but they are sitting in jail or in prison awaiting trial. And there are many factors involved in that. So how did we get here? That order of magnitude increase in number of incarcerated people. Well, it began in 1971 when President Nixon declared the war on drugs. At the time, Nixon was known for having created enemies lists, people he considered to be enemies of himself and his administration. And many of those lists had individuals' names on them. But when he was interviewed some years later, Nixon aide John Ehrlichman reported that President Nixon saw that he had two major groups of enemies, and they were the anti-war left and Black people. And so he utilized the war on drugs to focus on those two groups of enemies. In the case of the anti-war left, one of the major steps that was taken was to declare marijuana a Schedule I drug, accompanied by heroin and LSD. Marijuana, heroin, and LSD. Schedule I drugs. During his administration, the Drug Enforcement Agency was created. The government dramatically increased the size and presence of federal drug control agencies. The practices of mandatory sentencing and no-knock warrants were introduced. And so there was a significant shift that occurred with the passage of legislation under President Nixon, all of which was continued and extended in the presidency of Ronald Reagan. And we didn't just see the additional emphasis on drugs, we saw the emergence of a powerful collection of what are today known as dog whistles. Lee Atwater was a Republican Party strategist in the 1980s who worked closely with President Reagan. And he was filmed, Lee Atwater was filmed in 1981, talking about the strategic approach to managing racial discrimination. He said, quote, "You start out in 1954 by saying N-word, N-word, N-word. By 1968, you can't say N-word. It backfires. It hurts you. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting really abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And a byproduct of them is Black people get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than N-word, N-word. And so President Reagan, when he ran for office and was elected, focused significantly on aspects of what's called race baiting. After he secured the Republican nomination in 1980, he launched his official campaign at a county fair just outside Philadelphia, Mississippi, which you may recall was the place where three voting rights activists, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, had been murdered by police 16 years earlier. He selected that location on the advice of a local official who had written to the Republican National Committee assuring them that the Neshoba County Fair would be an ideal place for winning George Wallace inclined voters. So when Reagan arrived, there were about 10,000 white people chanting, "We want Reagan." And he returned the favor by assuring them, "I believe in states' rights." 2 years later, he came back, that time to endorse the neo-Confederate slogan, "The South shall rise again." On the stump, he blasted welfare cheats. He invoked the story of a mythical Chicago welfare queen with, quote, 80 names, 30 addresses, 12 Social Security cards, who's collecting veterans' benefits on 4 non-existing deceased husbands. She's got Medicaid, getting food stamps, and she's collecting welfare under each of her names. Her tax-free cash income is over $150,000. Often he placed her behind the wheel of a Cadillac, tooling around in flashy splendor. But he didn't stop there with that stereotype. He focused on another stereotypical image, that of the white people. They were the workers, the taxpayers, the persons playing by the rules and struggling to make ends meet, while brazen minorities partied with their hard-earned tax dollars. He would talk about you standing in line at the supermarket, while ahead of you in line was a strapping young buck buying T-bone steaks with food stamps, and all you can afford is hamburger. And so the race issue became a central part of his messaging and a central part of his expansion of the war on drugs. During his presidency, the emphasis, the focus, the disproportionate focus on crack cocaine began to emerge. And so in 1986, during his administration, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act that year, enhanced in 1988, and it differentiated for the first time between crack and powder cocaine. Now, the reality is pharmacologically, crack and powder cocaine are identical, but crack is cheaper to manufacture and it sells for a lower price. And so it was the drug of choice for people at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale, which frequently included African Americans. That bill also introduced not just the concept, but the practice of mandatory minimum sentences for drug crimes. And so, if you were found in possession of 5 grams of crack and convicted, the mandatory minimum sentence would be applied of 5 years in prison. In order for the same sentence to be applied, you had to be in possession of 500 grams of powder cocaine, a 100-to-1 discrepancy. And with these mandatory minimum sentences, the power in the criminal justice system moved from the judge, who no longer had any discretion in terms of sentencing, to the prosecutor, who made the decision about what charges to bring in the first place. So we have 2 Republican administrations that have played a major role in mass incarceration, but the Democrats were not to be left out. We're going to go back first for a moment to the year 1915, which was a notable year in race relations in the United States. It marked the release of D.W. Griffith's blockbuster, Klan-glorifying Birth of a Nation film that romanticized the role of terrorist posses in the post-Civil War South and created a sense of nostalgia for the great years of white supremacy. That same year, and Thanksgiving, William J. Simmons gathered 15 men to initiate what became known as the Second Klan. They climbed to the summit of Stone Mountain, just outside Atlanta, built an altar of 16 boulders on which they placed an American flag, a copy of the Holy Bible, and an unsheathed sword. Then they raised an enormous wooden cross and set it on fire. Following that Klan resurrection ceremony, the group held regular events there. In the 1920s, they began fundraising with the United Daughters of the Confederacy to erect an enormous Confederate monument on the face of the mountain: Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson, and Robert E. Lee. For most of the 20th century, they held the Klan's annual Labor Day cross burning at Stone Mountain until 1991. And in fact, one of the lines in Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech is "Let freedom ring from Stone Mountain in Georgia." So we come to the 1990s and we come to the presidential candidacy of William Clinton. And he arranged a photo op at Stone Mountain. He was intent on demonstrating that he was not soft on crime. So he held a press conference at Stone Mountain, surrounded by Georgia Governor Zell Miller, Senator Sam Nunn, and Congressman Ben Jones, and gave a press conference while standing in front of a phalanx of jumpsuited prisoners from Stone Mountain Prison. And you don't have to look with a magnifying glass to see the racial makeup of that group of prisoners. The message was intentional. And so, during President Clinton's administration in 1994, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act was passed as part of his Get Tough on Crime initiatives. It is one of the harshest laws ever enacted in United States history. It provided for 3 strikes, you're out, 3 felony convictions, and the sentence is life in prison without the possibility of parole. And that sentence could be imposed on someone as young as 13 years old. In reality, as imposed, more than 50% of the people serving a life in prison without parole have never committed a violent crime. This law also introduced new federal capital crimes that would call on the death penalty, and it provided $10 billion in funding for state prisons and $11 billion for state and local police. Now remember, this was the 1990s when $1 billion was a lot of money. And so all of this continued until in 1995, Congress was disturbed about this sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine, and they created a bipartisan U.S. Sentencing Commission to look at it. The commission recommended that that disparity be eliminated, but Congress overrode their recommendation and kept the 100-to-1 crack to cocaine disparity in mandatory sentencing. And it remained in effect until 2010, when the Fair Sentencing Act was finally enacted, and it reduced the 101 discrepancy to 18-to-1. So still a huge variance in terms of the amount of drugs that would trigger that mandatory sentence. And I think it's important if we take a step back here for a minute and look at what has happened since in the drug world. And one of the major elements has been the opioid epidemic of recent years. The opioid epidemic is almost universally treated as a public health crisis, not a crime. Imagine if we had treated these addictions as a public health crisis instead of a crime. And look what happened because we didn't. And further, today, marijuana, while until actually I think very recently was still a Schedule I drug in the terms of the federal government, is now legal in many, many states. So the basis for many of these arrests and much of this prosecution is based on outdated views of addiction and crime. So how did all this happen? I mean, the police were busy. They were enforcing the law. They were arresting people. They were testifying in court. How did we go from 200,000 to 22.3 million people and all these drug arrests? Well, significant law enforcement incentives were put into place so that in 1982, as part of legislation, federal cash grants were issued to state and local law enforcement agencies to make the enforcement of drug laws a priority. Based on those dollars, then police would turn their attention to enforcing drug laws as opposed to some other aspects of community life. And a significant event occurred in 1984 when legislation expanded the federal civil asset forfeiture law. I'd like to see all of you and ask you to raise your hands if you know about the civil asset forfeiture law. I confess I did not. But what it says is that the government can seize property suspected of being connected to criminal activity, even if criminal charges are never filed. And so initially, if you made a drug raid, you could seize the drugs and the equipment. Later on, it was expanded that you could also take any money or securities that were associated with the operation. Then you could get real property. But in 1984, this law, I'm sorry, somebody needs to be muted.
Effective March 10th, we're back in the office 5 days a week.
All right, I'm muting people. In 1980, whoops, excuse me. I'm pushing the wrong buttons. In 1984, up until 1984, all of the funds that were seized through these criminal raids, the money went to the federal and the state governments as general revenue. And so they were used when these civil assets were seized, they were used to help fund the federal government and state governments broadly. But the law changed in 1984 when it was determined that any of these seizures, the proceeds, would specifically be held by law enforcement agencies for law enforcement purposes. Further, the federal law changed to say if we partner with the state in these raids, then there will be something called an equitable sharing program where the states will get a share of the assets we seize. And those assets don't go to the general state budgets. They will go to the law enforcement agencies for their sole use. So this bypassed state laws that said something else, and it gave the funds to federal and state agencies for law enforcement equipment, weapons, salaries and overtime, training, travel expenses, informant reward money, detention facilities. In 1986, that total amount seized was $93.7 million. By 2013, the amount seized that year was $4.2 billion. And so those funds were used to give burn grants to create narcotics task forces. They began giving cash grants to state and local law enforcement agencies on the basis of the number of drug arrests that they made. And you began to see that huge increase in the number of people incarcerated. And in the period from 1997 to 1999, there were 3.4 million orders of Pentagon equipment delivered to state and local law enforcement agencies. So that today you may see a picture or a video of a protest where the protesters are met by law enforcement members who look like they could be transplanted as is to Kyiv or Kosovo or Gaza or wherever. The rate and the magnitude of the weapons of war that have been provided to state and local law enforcement agencies through the use of these funds is extraordinary. And it hasn't just been these direct impacts on the people involved. There is collateral damage that has resulted through this war on drugs, this mass incarceration. And at the top of the list is the assault on the Constitution's Fourth Amendment, which reads, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly or specifically describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized." I remember a criminal case decades ago, can't even tell you what it was, but someone was clearly guilty of a major crime, and the evidence was presented at trial and it was conclusive. But it turned out that the warrant for the search had defined the house of the individual to be searched, and the evidence was found in a detached garage. The garage was not listed in the warrant, and so the evidence could not be admitted to trial. So that was how explicit and how definitive, based on the Fourth Amendment, the right to privacy, protection from unlawful search and seizure was interpreted. But we're not seeing that anymore. Beginning in 1968, a Supreme Court decision entitled Terry v. Ohio, the court substantially expanded police power to search and seize and limited the rights of privacy of individuals. Prior to that, police couldn't stop people just because they felt like it, but the Terry decision expanded the notion of a warrantless search. You don't need a warrant if you observe suspicious behavior. And so all the police needed to do was say that the individual was suspicious, behaving suspiciously, looked suspicious. It was used to target African Americans for wearing flat brim hats and hooded sweatshirts. That was classified as suspicious behavior and would occasion a warrantless search and seizure. And it was expanded by a Supreme Court decision in 1996, Wren v. United States, where it allowed law enforcement the ability to stop a person in a motor vehicle based on a pretext and then search. All of this, coupled with racial bias, resulted in a significant racial bias in the use of stop and frisk. And these arrests and these charges and these incarcerations and the lack of bail resulted in huge disruptions in social relationships as people lost their jobs, couldn't return to their families, couldn't afford to pay bail. All of this an outgrowth of the significant restriction, impairment of Fourth Amendment rights against search and seizure. We also see the collateral damage of this time period in the militarization of the police and indeed the use of excessive force. Police shootings of unarmed Black men with impunity. And these behaviors and this adversarial connection and relationship, this fear of an African American that just simply walking down the street, I could be subject to stop, to frisk, to arrest, contributed to the continuing erosion of trust in the mission that many police organizations describe as the responsibility to protect and serve. And I think we find we have to ask ourselves the question, protect and serve who? So here we are. There has been an explosion in life sentences without parole. The rate has quadrupled since 1984. And once again, more than half of the people serving that sentence have never committed a single violent crime. And what it means is that those serving those sentences, even those juveniles, are likely to die in prison. In part because if you are sentenced to death, you are provided by law with an appeals process and with access to legal representation if you can't afford it yourself. But in the case of the life in prison without possibility of parole, neither applies. You are not entitled to appeals. You are not entitled to legal representation. And so, indeed, you are likely to die in jail. All of this system of incarceration is fed by the system of probation and parole. So when we look at the correctional control system, there are those who are incarcerated, but more than half of that 7 million are on probation or on parole under the control of the criminal justice system. Delaware does not have a parole system, but we do have probation. And the laws around probation violation are rather extraordinary. If you violate your probation and are arrested for that violation, you are immediately returned to prison. There is no hearing, there is no trial, there is no discussion. You go back to jail. And so statistics in recent years have shown that within 3 years of being released from prison in Delaware, 75% of those released will be reincarcerated, and less than 10% of them will have committed a new crime. They will have violated parole. They missed a meeting with violated probation. They will have missed a meeting with a probation officer. They will not have submitted their change of address, their current address. And of course, for many of these people, they don't have a home to go back to, and they move from place to place. And you have to keep the Department of Corrections informed of your address. If you are found possessing alcohol or firearms, or in the company of someone that you are not to associate with, you return to prison. So one of the consequences of all of this, 2.3 million people incarcerated at any given point in time, is where are we going to put them and who is going to pay for it? Now, initially, we know the law passed during the Clinton administration provided 10 or 11 billion dollars for building new prisons. In fact, there was a point in time when a new prison was opening in the United States every 2 weeks as part of accommodating this new group of people who needed to be incarcerated. And that was all well and good for the construction of the prisons, but it didn't help with the operating costs. And state budgets were overloaded with attempting to handle all of this and to manage it. And so a capitalist solution developed known as private for-profit prisons. And in 1998, there were 5 in the country. By 2008, there were 100. And that year, their profits were up 500%. Now, if we think about for-profit organizations, generally speaking, if you are responsible for a for-profit organization, your compensation is based on the amount of profit that you generate. It's very easy to measure, and it can be very simple to tie compensation to results. So if you're running a for-profit prison, it is your objective to create as much profit as you can. So how does that come about? Well, you get prisoners in, you get paid by the state to house and feed them, and then you deduct your costs. And obviously, you have to pay the electric bill and you have to buy food. But when it comes to rehabilitation programs, those are more discretionary. So, to what extent do you want to utilize what would otherwise be precious profit dollars on funding rehabilitation programs? If it means that your bottom line at the end of the year is lower. And if you wanted to be really cynical, I suppose you could ask, how successful do you want those prisoners to be when they return to society? When if they come back, it has the potential to increase your top line. And what we know is that rehabilitation programs in incarcerating institutions are woefully inadequate in helping to prepare people to return to the community. And in fact, one of the really cruel provisions of that Clinton administration Crime Control Act, you may have heard of Pell Grants. Pell Grants are federal government program that is designed to help people achieve college educations by providing some financial support. And before the 1996 act was passed, prisoners, incarcerated people, were entitled to receive Pell Grants so that they could pursue college educations prior to their release. But that act declared that Pell Grants were not available to incarcerated individuals. So if they wanted to gain a college education in preparation for return to society, they would need to find some other way to fund the costs. Seems a bit cruel. Something that would occupy probably a whole class in and of itself is the impact of cash bail and fines and fees on those who are arrested, charged, and convicted, often of minor infractions. While there is a huge push underway in Delaware to reform the fines and fees application, it needs a huge push because the inequities in it have been so dramatic. Typically, you might get a traffic fine of $75. But the law provides that fees are added to your fine. There's a fee for the public defender's office. There's a fee for the ambulance services. There's a fee for the firefighters. There's a whole range of fees where typically a $75 fine will result in a $500 debt to the government that you need to repay immediately or according to an agreed upon schedule. And if you miss a payment and fall behind, the state government has the right to issue a warrant for your arrest. They may or may not end up arresting you. But 5 years ago, the state issued almost 50,000 arrest warrants for people who had fallen behind on paying their fines and fees. And at that time, the first thing that happened when the warrant was issued was that your driver's license was suspended. You might not even know that. But here you are working, doing what you can. For whatever reason, you can't make the payment on your fines and fees. And now your driver's license is suspended. And should you get stopped without an effective driver's license, the whole cycle will start again and get added to what you already owed. Fortunately, legislation has changed the requirement that the driver's license be suspended, and more work is actively underway to eliminate fines that have nothing to do with the charge for which you were arrested. There's an amazing organization working hard on that, and Delaware should be proud of the advances that are being made. But here we are. Here we are. And in 2016, there was a judge in Massachusetts. Supreme Judicial Court Chief Justice Ralph Gantz began to look at the demographics and the statistics around the criminal justice system in the state. And he saw, at least on the surface, huge demographic differences as the criminal justice system was in operation. And he was curious as to how the state might, quote, take a hard look at how we can better fulfill our promise to provide equal justice for every litigant. And so Harvard University was tasked with a project to look at that. They gathered the raw numbers from nearly every government agency in the state's criminal justice system, examined the data, researched the disparate outcomes, and produced a report on what they found. They reviewed more than 1 million cases, and they found that 665 of every 100,000 Black people versus 82 of every 100,000 white people were incarcerated in the state. While Black people made up 24% of the population, they were the subject of 63% of the stop, frisk, searches that occurred during that time period. Once arrested, more Black people were detained without bail. And if bail was set, it was set higher than for white people for the same crimes. More severe offenses were charged against Black people who were arrested, often resulting in a referral to Superior Court where the mandatory minimum sentences took hold. And looking at the same crime, the average sentence for a Black inmate was 168 days longer than that for a white inmate. And the other intriguing part of the higher offenses being charged is while they were higher when they were charged, when they were finally adjudicated, the charges tended to equal that which had even originally been charged against the white defendants. And I think we know that Massachusetts cannot be alone in this. And so what we see in today's criminal justice system is an extensive erosion of our Fourth Amendment rights, and those apply to all of us. And today they are surely being applied to Black and brown people, to immigrant communities. Our criminal justice system, based on affirmative data studies, shows that our system is racially biased at every step in terms of who gets stopped, of those stopped, what proportion are actually arrested, of those arrested, how severe are the charges. The bail conditions that are set are more extreme for Black than for white. The availability of legal representation is less. There are a significantly higher number of plea bargains versus trial, in part because of the ability to afford meaningful legal representation, or the fear that by going to trial, if convicted, one of those mandatory minimum sentences will be imposed. And the overall lack of the possibility to appeal. And so it is inescapable that the criminal justice system in our country is in desperate need of reform at all levels, federal, state, and local. The good news is that action is underway in various places across the country. Delaware is notable for the progress that it is making, but progress is being made in other states as well, less so at the federal level. And in any case, so much more reform is needed. Police reform, bias training, body cameras, use of force standards, the impunity with which egregious police actions can still be carried out. We need more transparency around the data of what's happening and how are people being treated and where are the inequities. And so it is up to us to become aware of initiatives in our state, at the federal level, to speak up, not just to voice our support, but to demand action over these profound inequities that are so dramatically harming people's lives and keeping us from the next steps forward to a more perfect union.